Would you ask Mr. Sawyer to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Sawyer, on we go if you're ready. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Mr. Sawyer. We were just about to turn to the 15th of June, and there's one topic I'd like your assistance with is in relation to David Curry. Is it right that you actually had contact with him on the evening of the 14th of June?
Yeah, it was a phone call.
Yes. And you set out at paragraph 36, perhaps we could open it up so we have it all in front of us, that you spoke to him on the phone, and during the call, David Curry briefed me and he confirmed he's just about to start a night shift, and I expressed concern that he needed to be available during the day to support the council's overall response, and he acknowledged that concern. We know that you saw him on the 15th of June and he was working for a short period of time, but then went on to, he was still working night shift, he wasn't working during the day. Is that correct?
As I understand it, yes.
Was there any response or update as to why he remained on nights and not worked during the day of the 15th of June and 16th of June?
No mention of that. Having raised it also in my statement with Tony Redpath as well, and that links back to this point about RBKC utilising the right staff in the right roles at the right time to support their decision making.
So we know that he wasn't there during the day on the 15th of June, and what impact did you think that would have had or did have on the RBKC response on the 15th of June and then 16th of June?
The impact was simply that, from what I could see, their overall response required it was very fragmented, and it needed someone somewhere centrally to be advising Nicholas appropriately about the right structures that needed to be in place and the way in which that could best be delivered, the types of frameworks, planning, or sort of the response arrangements that needed to be put into place. And my view was that if David had been around there during the day, in the day on day one, rather than not being there on the 14th, he might have been able to guide and steer the local authority response, and particularly Nicholas Holgate, into greater understanding about what was required, the scale that was of what was required to be put into place, and that may have changed certain decisions RBKC made on the 14th.
So is it your view that you consider that there was a vacuum in terms of specialist advice that could have been given to the town clerk, Nicholas Holgate, on the 15th of June or the 14th of June?
Well, I went in and probably filled that role to some extent on the 15th.
Yes.
Therefore, the question is, why wasn't there someone from RBK to do that for them?
Yes, and there wouldn't have been somebody doing that on the 14th of June if David Curry was not there.
Yeah, and I can't obviously comment on what difference that would have made on the 14th. I can just comment on the fact that there was a vacuum on the 15th that needed to be filled.
So it's right, isn't it, that you had, on the 15th of June, a meeting early in the morning with both David Curry and Nicholas Holgate, is that correct?
Correct.
And how did you find, in terms of how he appeared, Mr. Curry, when you saw him on the 15th of June?
I think, as described in my statement, he was traumatised and emotional and tired.
And whilst he was there, did you consider he was able to actually assist Mr. Holgate?
No.
Because
Sorry, I did consider that he wasn't fit to support Nicholas, yes.
We'll see in due course, but in one of your post-fire reflections, you say that briefing by DK, David Curry, emergency planning manager, he confirmed he's traumatised, not in position to offer strategic direction with influence. Is that a fair summary?
Definitely.
And we'll see that document in a moment. Did you raise with Mr. Holgate on the 15th of June that Mr. Curry wasn't around and should be around, or there was an absence of support he required?
I had several conversations with Nicholas Holgate. I don't recall the detail of all of them. I do recall, as I mentioned earlier, referencing David Curry's the vacuum created by him being on night shift to Tony Redpath. But I think as the day progressed, it became more and more clear that the RBKC as an organisation needed additional support. So, to be honest with you, the vacuum created by David not being there, I think we moved on to some extent.
Yes.
And started talking about, so what extra help do you need? But I, like I say, I did reiterate my concern about David and the need for him to still be around during the day.
Let's move to paragraph 69 of your statement, which is at page 14. And it just provides a useful summary of what you were doing soon after your arrival. You had attended with some notes, which you talked through, including the type of structures and groups Nicholas Holgate would need to consider adopting as the instant move from response to recovery, and what was required to ensure a smooth transition. I then raised the point that the RBKC should consider what additional support it required and what conditions it would wish to apply in discussions with the Metropolitan Police Service considering the formal handover from response to recovery. Terms we've heard already, emergency response and to recovery. Could you briefly explain the significance of when an emergency moves from response to recovery?
Without quoting the guidance, my general understanding would be that response transitions to recovery at the point whereby there's no longer a risk to life, and that the situation has stabilised, and that at that point the blue light organisations start to withdraw.
And let me assist you in relation to the non-statutory guidance in relation to this, paragraph 5.1.5. The recovery phase should begin at the earliest opportunity following the onset of an emergency, running in tandem with the response to emergency. It continues until disruption has been rectified, demands and services have returned to normal levels, and the needs of those affected directly and indirectly have been met. Is that what you were alluding to when you were asked?
Yeah, the final points within that, sorry.
And the needs of those affected directly and indirectly have been met.
Yeah, obviously that's a moot point in terms of the Grenfell response.
And when would you expect, normally, from your experience, that transition to occur from emergency response to recovery?
Traditionally, it is reasonably quick. It depends on the scale of the incident, and every incident is obviously different. So I wouldn't like to put a definitive time frame on that, but it is obviously a time at which all parties concerned are satisfied that those, if not all, some of that criteria has been met, and then it transitions to the local authority who are responsible for supporting the community, leading the community within that area. So therefore, it is an agreed point in time.
And we saw from earlier emails on the day before that there was an expectation that the response would move to recovery on the 15th of June. Is that correct?
No, that's
Nope.
incorrect. That wouldn't be my definitive view. I think there may have been suggestions that it was likely that would be at the point at which it would happen, but I don't recall any conversations that I was party to that suggested that was definitely going to happen.
Okay. Let's perhaps look at it from a different perspective. The night before, we saw an email where David Curry had been tasked overnight to produce the road to recovery. And that was loosely based on a senior management team, on an agenda for the senior management team this morning. You recall where we just dealt with that before lunchtime. So that was something which was referred to in correspondence the night before. When you attended and had your meeting with David Curry, was there any response? Was there any document prepared in relation to setting out a route map in relation to the going towards recovery?
No, not that I saw. And just to qualify the previous question,
Yes.
as far as I'm concerned, by defining that route towards recovery, that path, wasn't necessarily to me an indication that it was definitely going to happen on the 15th.
This flows from your answers so far. Did you think, from what you saw and what was being discussed on that morning, on the 15th of June, did you consider that ORBKC was in a position to transition from response to recovery?
No.
And why was that?
For two reasons. Firstly, I don't think that they had robust enough arrangements in place to effectively manage the recovery process. And secondly, I think there had been a complete loss of trust and confidence in RBKC, and therefore for them to lead on the recovery, strategies and action would have been required to restore some of that faith and confidence in the local authority.
And in relation to the latter matter, that loss of trust as you described it, when did that become apparent to you that that was a significant factor?
I had no idea whatsoever before the fire, even on the 14th, the level of mistrust there was circulating amongst the community. So this was brand new to me. I think it started to hit home probably on the 15th, when again more news was being shared and the situation became clearer.
And when we were looking at your statement in paragraph 69, you were referring to, you raised the point about what ORBKC should consider with what additional support it required. And what support did you consider that they required?
At that point, I hadn't really got to grips with exactly what they had in place in the first place. And to be honest with you, as always in this, I'm not sure RBKC knew what additional support they needed. There wasn't that single point of truth in terms of how they were responding. The BEC wasn't functioning effectively, and therefore discussions were taking place without the full picture understood.
Situational awareness is perhaps another term for it.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes.
Well, I think we'll cover that in just a moment. Well, let's move on then to, this is your early meeting. We then know that there was an ORBKC Gold group meeting, seniorship management team meeting, at 10 o'clock on the 15th of June. What was your assessment as an observer of that meeting?
I think, as detailed in the statement, I think it was very operational. And I think that was because there wasn't this, for want of better words, consistent understanding of the situation. I think it was too big. And I think there was no, it was too polite. And I need to qualify that. It was. I think it may have been described as a board meeting by other people giving evidence, and it was for me very similar to a traditional style of local authority meeting, very polite, very structured. It wasn't dynamic, it wasn't forward-looking, and it. I think I've probably said enough about that meeting.
Well, let's look at paragraph 73, if you could scroll down. It chimes with what you just told us. This last sentence. You say, after the meeting, I suggested to Nicholas Holgate that the meeting had been very operational and not strategic enough. And you asked him to consider reducing the membership. We could see overleaf. What was his response when you said to him that the meeting was too operational and not strategic enough?
I'm not sure I got a response to that.
How receptive was Nicholas Holgate to your input on the 15th of June?
I believe he was receptive. I think I don't recall a particular comment in terms of that previous statement just made. He was receptive, but I think he was trying to oversee the council response in a traditional local authority way, which meant that if that was his senior management team, then he probably wouldn't have wished to pick and choose who he involved, whereas I would have picked and choose those heads of services, those heads of directors in various departments who actually had something to contribute.
So a more streamlined approach.
Yeah, and I think that would be the more effective way of having a real strategic level conversation. And the thing that was missing was not so much this is what we need to do now. There wasn't a clear deadline placed on anything as far as I can remember, and there wasn't a sense of this is what we need to do within the next 24, 48, 72 hours, and a forward look to add some sense of direction and purpose to the response.
And is that what you mean when you refer to not being strategic enough?
Yes.
I'm going to move on to the Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group, which, again, the panel have heard quite a lot of evidence in relation to. That was something which was being assembled that day, and the first meeting took place at 2:00 on the 15th of June. And at paragraph 75, if we could see just in front of us, you had contact with Sue Redmond. You say this: I spoke to Sue Redmond, who nominated ORBKC Halo, and I noted the extreme pressure she was under due to the pace in which the response was required and the scale of the situation. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Would you have expected a Halo to be appointed before the 15th of June? Would you have expected one to be appointed on the 14th of June, for instance?
I would have expected on the 14th of June someone to be designated with the responsibility to lead on the response to the community. I think within their borough emergency management plan it references a welfare bronze.
Yes.
The question is, who does that welfare bronze report into? And yes, I would have expected someone to be tasked with leading the humanitarian assistance response.
And that's something, the Halo is something which is a role identified in the Humanitarian Assistance Framework, one of the London Resilience documents, is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you aware that she had no training before in that role as a Halo?
If I didn't, then I would have been informed on that morning.
And again, just so that the panel perhaps can assess how normal this is, would you expect in that sort of situation for the appointed Halo to be somebody with no previous experience in that role?
No.
You wouldn't expect.
Well, if you define experience as appropriately trained, having exercised and understand the role and what's required, then I would expect that. In terms of experience, there are so few incidents that have of the scale that would require a full-blown humanitarian assistance response, then direct experience, no.
No. But you would expect, is it right from your answer, someone who was appointed would have the requisite training?
Yes.
And exercising that role?
Yes.
And did you provide assistance to Miss Redmond in relation to her carrying out her role?
I did in the lead up to the meeting, but not during the meeting because I wasn't in the room.
And is it the case that you invited and asked Toby Gould to assist?
Yes, I did. I did, and that included sending the meeting invites to those people that had been omitted by RBKC in the first round of invites.
There was probably a lot of things going on in relation to your involvement on the 15th of June, but were you aware that that invitation for Toby Gould to assist Miss Redmond was around 1:30? That's when that request was made to him. Does that sound about right?
That's correct, and after that was prompted by me.
And it led to Mr. Gould doing his best by sending out invites to the voluntary sector and an updated agenda about 10 minutes before the meeting.
Correct.
Would you agree, far from an ideal set of circumstances, sending out information such as that so close to an important meeting?
Without doubt.
I want to move on to communications. At paragraph 72, you refer to speaking to Martin Fitzpatrick, and he was head of the media communications team at ORBKC. And you explained that he had failed to dial into the London Gold Communications Group conference call at 8:30. in the morning. And it states Martin Fitzpatrick indicated that the requests may have been lost in 200 emails he had not had time to open. Is that correct?
That's what that event happened, yes.
Yes. And what would the purpose, again, to assist the panel, of a London Gold Communications Group conference? What would that be?
That's part of the London Resilience Partnership structures and arrangements following a response strategic coordination arrangements. It's an opportunity for comms leads, communications leads from all of those key responding agencies to align messaging, share what anything relevant in terms of communications, and ensure that there is a coherent approach to messaging both the local community and the rest of London as necessary.
And was it a cause of concern that the head of the media communications team at RBKC had not participated in that call?
It was concern enough for, I believe, someone from London Resilience Group to tell me that he hadn't been on that call, and therefore it was sufficiently important for me to raise it with him. And can I just add that I'm not sure if you have the minutes from that conference call. If RBKC are on that call, then that was obviously, I wasn't aware of that, but also I would have expected Martin Fitzpatrick to be aware if they were on the call or not.
Well, we've heard it's a pretty small team, the media communications team, and you've given your advice there about the difficulties he raised in relation to the volume of material in terms of emails. What view did you form during the 15th of June whilst you were at the town hall of how the communications team were performing at RBKC?
That was one of the areas I didn't really delve too deeply with.
Nope. Well, let's have a quick look at GOL *001301. These are your post-incident reflections, which we will touch upon. But on the fourth line, we can see comms team in denial and overwhelmed. Asked why I missed 8:30! I'm not sure if that's deliberate or not. Comms call missed amongst 200 emails. So it's really the first part of the sentence I'd like your assistance with. Comms team were in denial and overwhelmed. What did you mean by that?
The overwhelmed aspect of that was a link to the 200 emails, small team, etc., etc. The denial piece, I can't recall.
Okay. I wonder if we could go back to your statement. We'll refer to this document again in a short while, but if you go back to your statement at paragraph 50 of your first statement, please, page 10. Thank you. And you set out really what your approach. Third line, disinvolvement include gaining an understanding of the methods and structures being applied by RBKC to manage the response across the range of responsibilities, including humanitarian assistance, housing, mass fatalities, and generic command and control functions. So really this draws together what you say in your statement. So you've done a number of things, and it allowed you to gain an understanding of their structures. Is that right?
Yes.
And at paragraph 54, you set out your opinion. You say this: however, in my opinion, I did not believe that Nicholas Holgate had complete awareness of the scale and complexity of what RBKC were being asked to deal with a lack of full situational awareness across the senior management team. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
When did you form that view?
Around lunchtime, I think, maybe early afternoon. I can't be specific, but because, like I say, this just evolved. That understanding
Yes.
evolved, and there were a number of specific elements that led me to form my overall opinion, which then, as I said earlier, led to a conversation with John Barradell late afternoon.
Well, Well, the conversation I think you referred to was the day before on the 14th, so we're on the 15th.
This is a new conversation.
Which we'll move on to that conversation. But in relation to conversations, did you raise these concerns with Mr. Holgate that he had a lack of understanding of the complexity of what ORBKC were to deal with, and there was a lack of full situation, no awareness?
I don't know. I don't recall discussing that with him in those terms. No, I don't recall that.
Should you have?
I think that goes back to my comment earlier about I should have stepped in earlier and made that more clearly known. But I think, as I said, the intention was always to go in there and try and assist. I had several conversations with Tony Redpath because Nicholas was always very, appeared very busy. And I raised the issue about situational awareness definitely with him. And so I was hoping, just with the intention of trying to help, that by flagging these things as the day progressed, the situation would improve.
Were you trying to encourage, nudge, points towards areas to improve? Is that how you, in reality, your approach was?
That is a really good way of describing that. And the other way, whether right or wrong, I still felt that I was a guest in RBKC. I'd been allowed in rather than having the authority to go in and actually instruct and change. So it was working with them to ensure that I remained seen as supportive and trying to help rather than not.
And in retrospect, you've alluded to twice now sort of lessons learned. Is a lesson that you've learned is that you should have been more challenging in highlighting the extent of how ORBKC were going wrong?
Yeah, and exactly. And I think, again, testament to the fact that this was the first situation that I'd been involved with which required that level of assertion, be that level of assertiveness. And as I said, I think there were a number of events which culminated in the mid-afternoon that then led me to say to John Barrowdale, this isn't working.
Okay, we'll move that in a little while. Whilst we've got paragraph 54, let's continue just reading the last part. It was also my opinion that ORBKC had not been galvanised as an organisation due to witnessing members of staff seemingly continuing to deliver their day jobs, whilst a small number of individuals appeared to be dealing with a significant number of issues at the same time. What did you mean by that?
I think, without doubt, there were lots and lots of good people trying to do the best they possibly could. It may have been just, I acknowledge that there are still critical services that a local authority still needs to deliver, even in the midst of the tragedy at Grenfell. So that acknowledged, but there was just again this sense that I got that there were too few people trying to do too much, and I didn't at any stage hear the terms referenced that all non-critical services had been suspended, as an example. The fact that the humanitarian assistance group meeting had to be relocated because the IT wasn't working, etc. What I wasn't seeing is a team of people running around making the whole response work. So it's not just those people making decisions and dealing directly with the issues, it's the infrastructure around that to enable it to function effectively. And I didn't get any sense of that. And I think it links back, if I may, this may seem very minor, but I was very concerned when I walked into the council offices that morning and saw the pile of donations in the courtyard outside, and no sense of anybody being instructed or being tasked with dealing with that. There may well have been, but it was just my observations on the day.
One interpretation or impression from your answers was that there was a lack of urgency that you observed. Is that a fair impression?
I wouldn't necessarily say that that would be fair, because I'm sure in certain areas across the organisation there was urgency in terms of activity. What was lacking was an urgency to define the way in which the council should address these big issues that needed to be addressed. And that was, again, just my observations from the Gold meetings.
Well, let's return back to your post-incident reflections, which is GOL 401301. And we've touched upon some of these already, but I just want to deal with the remainder. I think we're just going to bring it up in a moment. GOL 401301, that's it. You mentioned already, this is what you noted down and emailed to yourself about a couple of weeks after the incident. We see on the first example, the one you just touched upon, the donations which you first observed, correct?
Correct.
Fifth line, CEO, no system to address offers of support. And you give an example where you suggest he should request acknowledgement. We mentioned that before lunch, that there was emails internally between you and LRG regarding Nicholas Holgate being too busy to consider offers of support. Did that remain an issue?
I can't say. Others will have been more cited than I was in terms of the actual offers coming in. I'm aware, for example, of the business sector panel
Sure.
making offers available. So yes, there were offers, but once the conversation was had at 5:30, then my focus moved more towards what we were going to do the next day and how we were going to ease into full sort of local authority gold support.
Well, you make an observation here, which is implicitly a criticism that there is no system in place to address offers of support. Perhaps, if I could put it this way, what system would you expect someone in that situation to have in place to deal with offers of support?
I would have expected there to have been a dedicated officer, perhaps within the BEC, Borough Emergency Control Centre, there where every offer of support would have been channeled through. That's the way I would have done it, and then allow that officer or that role to then disseminate. But the key is not just pinging it out, sorry for the technical term, of sending it on to people. It's about monitoring it. It's about making sure actually that it is actioned, which is why, again, I was particularly keen to highlight to Nicholas the offer from Borough Market, who had sadly obviously had the terrorist incident only a few days before that, but they were still willing and wanting to provide whatever support they could, which I thought was admirable. And I thought that it was worthy of a response. But this then also links to the sense that Nicholas didn't have sufficiently robust support around him to take some of the, for want of a better word, administrative burden away from him and allow him to do some of that strategic thinking which was required.
He was too operational rather than strategic.
I think he was overwhelmed.
Okay. I want to deal with one of the other observations you made, and you've touched upon already, is underneath that BEC failing with no situational awareness, no sit rep produced. Again, when did you form the view that the BEC was failing with no situational awareness? I
think that was after I went straight from observing the council gold meeting, I think at 10, into the SCG at 11, and it was after the SCG that I made that point. And I think then the overnight they were tasked with the situation report, so it materialised the next morning. And you mentioned raising this with Tony Redpath, is that correct? I believe so. And what was his response when you raised the lack of situational awareness in the BEC? I think he acknowledged that. I believe he acknowledged it from my recollection.
Whilst we have this document open, it's slightly out of sequence in terms of the timeline, but we see down at the bottom, challenge Director of Housing over suggestion residents would be spending a further night in rest centre. See minutes to 16th PM Gold meeting. Associated comments from Gold, it is adequate. Can you assist with the circumstances where you challenged the Director of Housing over that suggestion?
What I can recall is that there was a suggestion that there may still be people, residents, members of the community, having to spend an additional night or that night in a rest centre. And I questioned whether more could be done. Can't recall the exact words, but I questioned as to whether more should be done to ensure that didn't happen.
And the last feature is this. Due to continuing concerns on grip, arrange conference call on evening at approximately 5:30. And I'm going to ask you again, we will read it out now. Mid-call, Nick left room to speak to someone outside. In relation to that part, were you with Mr. Holgate at the town hall during this teleconference?
Yes, I was.
And this is something you noted, that he, during the teleconference with John Bardell and others, that he left the room to speak to somebody outside?
That's right.
Okay.
And sorry, if I may just
Yes.
contextualise that. I found it a little bit strange that he had the ear of Eleanor Kelly and John Barradell on the phone. They were talking to him about how he was coping and what additional support was required. And then Nicholas decided to leave the room and have a conversation with someone else outside, leaving us sat on the call. And I just didn't feel that was showing, it wasn't necessarily prioritising in the right way, because that call was very important in my mind.
And did you know who the person was or what the circumstances for the need for Mr. Holgate to absent himself?
No, but to be honest with you, it would have had to have been really, really important as far as I was concerned. But there was no indication of what it related to.
So you've mentioned this is an important call. Was it the case that was your suggestion that this call should take place?
It was my suggestion to Nicholas Holgate that he needed additional support and that he should set up the call with John and Eleanor. John Barradell and Eleanor Kelly.
Yes. And before this call, did you have contact with John Bardell so he was cited as to the issues
Yes.
you experienced?
Yes.
And what information did you relay to him in broad form?
Just a general assessment as described in my statement.
A lack of situational awareness, lack of grip.
Common term, but yeah, lack of grip. They just were not on top of it in a way which I would have expected, and therefore needed help.
You use the phrase concerned a number of times. What sort of gradient of concern had you at this stage prior to the call on the 15th of June?
Sufficient to suggest that call was important.
And did you advise Mr. Bardell as to any suggested course before that call?
I can't recall, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, John Barradell and I saw things in a similar way, and therefore I would expect him to know what was needed.
And this additional support, what did you envisage was going to occur or should occur at this stage?
Well, I think prior to the call, the main aim was to get Nicholas to realise he needed help, and I don't think he didn't appreciate that, but I think he needed that extra nudge to make it happen. As to what that additional support looked like, that was a conversation between Nicholas, John Barradell and Eleanor, and again I saw it very much as a peer-to-peer, chief executive to chief executive conversation.
In terms of chief executives, did you see London Local Authority Gold, Chris Naylor, who was at the previous meeting the day before, wasn't invited to this meeting? Was there any particular reason why that was?
I'm not sure of the exact timing, but I think there was a clear sense, particularly having just come off Westminster Bridge attack, the move to critical that the government implemented, and then finally, most recently, the London Bridge attack, and there was fear and concern that there would be another one imminently. So rather than tie up Chris Naylor, my understanding was that he would remain available to deal with any other unrelated incidents in London, and there are precedents for that.
Yes.
And John Barrow, in his capacity as chair of LAP, but more importantly, as an experienced chief executive, and I think actually that's probably the reason John was prepared to go in there and help, on the basis that he had the experience to try and make a difference.
Okay. In relation to this meeting, which took place, I think it was 5 o'clock actually on the 15th of June, no minutes or note of the meeting, is that correct?
Correct.
Again, why was that? Why was there no note of this important meeting as you described it?
I think in hindsight it should have been recorded, but at the time I treated it as a similar level of conversation to the previous day.
So you consider it a peer-to-peer,
Yes.
informal
Yes.
conversation?
Yes.
But actually, on your account, these are quite exceptional circumstances
Correct.
where you were sufficiently concerned to arrange a meeting or suggest a meeting was called.
Correct.
Can you recall whether Nicholas Holgate was given any advice during that meeting?
I don't recall the details of that meeting other than the outcome.
Well, tell us, what can you recall of the meeting?
Obviously, I remember Nicholas leaving. I remember there would have been a conversation around what support Nicholas required. But like I say, the minutiae of the conversation, I don't recall.
Can you assist with the length of the meeting?
I would suggest it was probably about 30 minutes.
How about the mood of the meeting?
Supportive.
How would you describe the approach of Mr. Holgate at that stage? You're talking about how he needed to consider what help he needed, and he perhaps hadn't arrived at that view that he needed assistance. Did that change during the meeting?
No, I think he was receptive. The fact that he was very happy to set up the meeting said to me that he was receptive to any support that was being made available to him.
And do you recall whether there was any discussion regarding the actual activation of the London Gold resolution?
I don't. What I can comment on that is that my understanding as a result of that meeting was that John Barrow was going to go into RBK the next morning to provide direct support and advice to Nicholas, read himself into the situation, understand the issues, the structures that were in place, understand what the resourcing needs were likely to be, and then at some point, having been read in, the local authority gold arrangements would be invoked, which would then allow John Barrow the ability to spend RBKC's money and commit resources on behalf of RBKC into the borough for RBKC to then manage.
And that view of the role of John Barrow, is that something which you recollect emerged after the meeting, or was this something which you recollect emerged during the meeting? It would have.
I would suggest it must have been discussed in terms of going in there the next day during the meeting.
Is it fair to say that you can't be sure because of the passage of time and the absence of a note?
Very much so.
John Hetherington, in his statement, recalls paragraph 76, just for the record, that on the 15th of June at 1839, you discussed London Gold being activated the following day. Does that sound correct?
I think that matches with what I've just described.
And he states that your discussion was subsequently reflected in the email, and let's have a look at that email to aid your recollection, LFB 000061236. And again, this may be one that the panel have seen already. 1902, you are not subject, you're not a recipient of this email, but Mr. Hetherington believes that this reflected your discussion. In light of an increasing complexity of the incidents, the recent request for mutual aid from RBKC and a number of other factors, the decision has been taken to activate LLG to own the incident and support directly RBKC. Current plan that as of tomorrow morning, Paul Martin, Wandsworth, will go to RBKC to support LLAG, and 3 other chief execs will be made available to support aspects of the response. Was it the case that at this initial stage, at 7 o'clock on the 15th of June, that John Bardell wasn't the person who was considered to be sent down to the town hall, but in fact it was a different chief executive, Paul Martin?
No, that's not correct. And if I may just add a comment about some of the language utilised within this email, where it talks about taken to activate LAG to own the incident. LAG supports the incident. It's owned by the Category 1 responder, local authority, RBKC. And in terms of, I think if you look at the wording of John Hetherington's sentence starting current plan is as of tomorrow, Paul Martin will go in to support LAG, not to perform the role of LAG.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And Mr. Hetherington has been asked already about this morning, but I just wanted to see if you had anything to add. Bear in mind, this was meant to reflect your conversation. So the evidence drawing together, your recollection at that meeting or soon after, there was discussion regarding activation of London Gold. We see an email shortly after which reflects a discussion you had with John Hetherington. So on the evening of the 15th of June, it's fair to say that activation had been discussed and agreed, correct?
Agreed that it would happen.
Yes.
I'm not party to any of the conversations around exactly when that would happen, other than I expected it the next day, hence the email as described. But I was also aware that mutual aid was already being facilitated, so that was an indication to me that support was starting to be generated for the benefit of RBKC. And I think also testament to that is the reference in that email about 3 other chief executives are being made available to support. So conversations had already started as a result of that 5:30 call.
And your answer sort of predicts the next question, really, regarding whether there was a delay and if there was any impact of delay. So we know it was 2 o'clock the following day, Friday the 16th of June, when it was formally activated. And do you know why that was? Why there was that passage of time, if I could put it neutrally, from the evening of the 15th of June to 2 o'clock on the Friday, the 16th of June, before formal activation?
No, I don't know as to why they waited until that point. I can comment on the 2 o'clock event if that would help. But I think I've referenced previously this belief that RBKC hadn't quite worked out what support it required, and therefore, rather than just throw everything at it and it not to be right, it was important to genuinely understand what was required. So I think the immediate need through the mutual aid request was for Beck staff, and I think additional support was then being sort of considered the next morning.
Would you accept there's a tension here between forming an understanding of what help they needed and the urgent need to provide humanitarian assistance to those affected?
Without doubt.
And it's right to say is that by the Thursday evening, there was extensive coverage in the media about how that was apparently failing. Is that correct?
To be honest with you, didn't look at the media that evening. I was busy doing this.
Yes.
But I would imagine that was the case.
And in terms of forming a view of what assistance they may need, they had your expertise there for a day, actually, to identify that there was significant failings in a number of areas. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
So what benefit would there have been, bear in mind you were there to assess and identify the need, waiting until the following day to 2 o'clock to formally activate LAG?
As previously stated, I wasn't party to the discussions around exactly when that transfer would happen, and Nicholas Holgate and John Barradell are probably better placed to do so.
Do you consider that has been termed a limbo period from the 15th over to the 16th, where the LAG resources weren't fully utilised?
There was I would suggest that the time spent between 5:30 and perhaps the gold meeting the following morning in RBKC would have been time well spent for them to have a genuine view of what extra resources they did require. I'm not sure that was delivered.
Or do you consider now that the London Gold resolution should have been formally activated at a sooner stage?
I think we would all probably have said it should have been invoked on the morning of the 14th.
But let's say a decision was made on the 15th, as you discussed at this meeting. Do you think it should have waited until the following day, or should it have been done sooner?
I think it would have been very challenging for John Barradell to have taken a view in terms of what resourcing was required, what level of support RBKC required, without actually going across and seeing it for himself.
Notwithstanding, and forgive me for probing you on this, but you mentioned a couple of times how you, John Barradell, work closely with each other, work of the similar mind. You would have known, wouldn't you, what was going through his mind and the challenges that he faced? You could assist him, couldn't you?
I wouldn't question with his decision to wait till the next morning and really read himself in.
Okay. I'm going to talk about that sort of post-activation period very briefly, if I may. What did you consider to be the main challenges post-activation and meeting the needs of those affected by the fire?
Restoring trust and confidence, and making sure that the housing needs of everyone affected was met in the most effective way possible.
And perhaps we could have a look at paragraph 95 of your statement, just to continue that answer. Thank you. Second line. The challenge faced, however, was the scale in terms of number of residents who sadly lost their lives to significant rehousing need, complexities such as the loss of the boiler supporting the Lancaster West estate, creating a larger impact footprint, and the local political dynamic, and finally the community reaction, which from the outset laid the blame on RBKC and the TMO. And these challenges would have made the response extremely difficult to coordinate from the outset. Does that reflect your evidence as to the challenges?
Yes, it does.
In relation to the larger impact footprint caused by the difficulties in the surrounding households, what was your understanding of the role London Local Authority Gold held in relation to responsibility for first Grenfell Tower residents, but also those walkway residents?
I think before I answer that question, it is worth just clarifying, if I may.
Of course.
London Local Authority Gold is a coordination role, providing resources, assets, support to the affected borough for it to then deploy and coordinate and manage locally. And I think that's played out in terms of how the mutual aid agreement is designed. So an offering local authority places its resources, people at the disposal of the affected borough. The role that John Barradell moved into in terms of being asked to lead the response was a conversation between him and Nicholas at 2:00 on the 16th. The technical details in terms of under what authority John Barradell undertook that lead role for the response is something that you would need to ask Nicholas and John Barradell about, because as I say, there is no legal basis upon which local authority Gold leads a response within a borough. So in terms of just clarifying that point, I think that's, for me, was important to share. In terms of what John did agree, in terms of whether it was the tower, whether it was the footprint, again, I think that is a conversation that you would need to have with Nicholas and John. But as far as I'm concerned, John's role was providing an effective response to those people directly affected by the incident.
Move on, please.
Sorry, my apologies. I refer people to the BSR, the bereaved survivors residents affected by the incident, because that's worthy of remembering.
Okay. I'm going to move on, if that's okay, to just briefly touch upon a sort of an assessment of the humanitarian response once led by London Gold from the 16th of June. You were closely supporting, were you not, John Barradell over these coming days?
Yes, I was.
And from that view, close up and assisting John Barradell, how long did you think it took for London Gold to be able to effectively and adequately meet the humanitarian needs of those affected by the fire?
As to my apologies, as to meeting the needs of those people affected, I think you would need to, as to when that occurred, I think every individual, every BSR will have their own views in terms of when their needs were actually met. What I would suggest is that by the Sunday, there were structures in place to ensure that there was an effective support could be mounted. So the Saturday, the 17th, a lot of time and effort was spent on creating, for want of a better word, an organisation from scratch. So this had never been done before. We needed to bring in the right expertise, the right people to make sure that we could make the difference that was required. So then I would suggest by the Sunday, we were in a much stronger position to try and go out and put into place what was required.
It's been described as a standing start. The sort of the Grenfell fire response team had to make a standing start on the Friday and Saturday of that weekend.
Correct, and we were very fortunate that there was appropriate accommodation in Westminster, and although ideally we would have not had to leave the RBKC offices on the Friday evening, but as a result of the demo, etc., it was the prudent decision to make. But it did then lead to us locating it in a far more suitable location, far more conducive to multi-agency collaboration and getting everybody in the one place to mount a concerted, coordinated response.
So it took time to put in the structures because this hadn't been done before. Structures were in place by close of play, perhaps on Sunday.
Yeah, I would need to check my records, but yeah, around that time. During Sunday was when we started to break through the the pressure of setting it up and actually start to really get into the meaningful work.
Yes. And we know that there was a press statement on the evening of the Sunday with Eleanor Kelly and the British Red Cross,
Correct.
which probably symbolised the Grenfell Fire Response Team starting in earnest. And then,
Well, it started. Sorry, I hope you don't mind.
no,
We didn't stop and just set up. There was still actions being delivered through the Saturday and Sunday, but clearly the priority was to create the structure, because without the structure you don't have that coordinated, coherent approach.
and does it follow that for those reasons it took a number of days to make a material difference to the response?
I couldn't say as to whether it was several days, because my focus, others may have a view. I don't have a view on that, because my focus was very much on getting the thing into a fit state to make a difference.
Perhaps another way to express is that issues did continue for a number of days, didn't they, in relation to communication with those at hotels, the Westway, and similar issues?
Without doubt, and one of the key challenges was the lack of data. And so to some extent, and not that I directly led on any of that work, but there was a significant challenge in terms of gathering the data and making sense of it.
And again, it's probably obvious from your answer, but data is in relation to the identification of those who were affected.
Yes, yeah, where they'd been located, which hotels, things like that, things that were essential to mount an effective humanitarian response. And there was a lot of uncertainty in those first few days.
And would you expect that, from your experience, to have that lack of data so many days after an incident?
No, I wouldn't. I would expect to have strong data 3-4 days after the event.
I'm going to move on to the last part of our questions to you and your evidence. Remember, we had 3 parts, and this is the post Grenfell Tower fire reviews which took place. And with your assistance, we're going to navigate through some of those and your updated EP 2020 review, and perhaps cover some of the matters you've raised in your second and third statement. So you've set out in your first statement a number of the post-fire reviews which took place in the London Civil Resilience Framework since 2017, supplemented by your second statement in April 2022. And your third most recent statement provides some final thoughts, the one that you provided on Thursday, following a period, as you described, reflection.
Yes.
And preparing to give evidence. If perhaps we could open GOL 401346, please. This is what we mentioned already, the EP 2020, Emergency Planning into 2020's April 2018 refresh. And that contains, we're not going to go through them all, 27 recommendations, is that correct?
Correct.
And is it right that in preparing this refresh report, you also reviewed your original EP 2020 report drafted in October 2016?
Correct.
And that had 14 recommendations. And you also considered 2 post-fire reviews, which we can see touched upon under background. Let's look at the first one. It says this: on the 7th of February, the local authorities panel endorsed a high-level implementation plan designed to address 11 recommendations contained in the, I want to emphasise this, the independent peer challenge review conducted by Tom Reardon and Mary Nay between October 2017 and February 2018. Tom and Mary, if you could turn over a leaf, please, page 2. Tom and Mary noted that recommendations for local government emergency planning resilience EP 2020 report contained a range of recommendations that are in the process of implementation, and endorsed this improvement work. Then goes on to make further recommendations to build on EP 2020. Let's have a look at this document briefly. GOL 50146. So this is the Independent Peer Challenge Review, January 2018. We see at page 1, and perhaps we could turn over to page 2, please. And we'll just deal with the introduction. The Independent Peer Challenge was commissioned in October 2017, as we just heard, by the London Council Leaders Committee, who wanted an independent view about the arrangements that underpin London local government's collaborative resilience work. The Peer Challenge had an agreed scope in light of the unprecedented challenges faced between March and September 2017. Pausing there, that was your point this morning, that it wasn't just the Grenfell Tower fire,
right,
but
correct.
there was a number of events in 2017. We've
Yes.
heard Mr. Adamson of the British Red Cross describe it as a sort of watershed year in terms of emergency planning. Not sure if you agree with that term.
Unprecedented.
Okay. Watershed and unprecedented. The second paragraph, the focus of this work was fitness of the collective response, not individual borough arrangements. And perhaps we could turn over, please, to page 3, please. And under findings, and we look at paragraph 7, we can see Grenfell Tower fire is in there. And I'm going to just deal with the 4 lines from the bottom. The peer review team heard from several stakeholders that the Grenfell Tower fire had undermined confidence in vital elements of the London local government's collective resilience arrangements. Many of the recommendations are intended to address these issues and help restore confidence. Is that right? Is that a fair summary?
I think it is, yes.
So this was the first of 2 reports which you considered. Let's turn to the second one, which is called the Assurance Framework Review, GOL 401596. Providing individual and collective assurance, and that's Sean Root, February 2018. If we could turn to page 2, please. Look at the circumstances. Again, executive summary. The review was commissioned by the City of London Corporation on behalf of the Local Authorities Panel in January 2018. Objective of the review is to recommend the means by which London local government can individually and collectively assure their organisations' preparedness, particularly their capacity and capability, through a credible, transparent, effective, and cost-effective approach. Is that right?
Correct.
We could have a look at page 3, please. And the third paragraph, which may chime with something you say in one of your later statements. This was in the 2018 report. There was a widespread view that there is limited involvement in emergency planning and resilience across most organisations, with most responsibility resting with emergency planning teams and chief executives. This review looks at the challenge of embedding a culture of emergency planning and resilience across an organisation in a way that reflects the health and safety culture. It becomes everyone's business. So in relation to that, this was mentioned in 2018. Do you consider that as still a current issue?
Yes, I do.
Could we also go to page 14, please? And paragraph 3.12. It talks about the statutory duties in relation to planning and recovery. And I want to just read out this aspect 4 lines down. Quote, on more than one occasion, recovery was described as the Cinderella of emergency planning, with a view that this was replicated across the country. There is little evidence to suggest the same level of attention has been paid to the recovery phase of an emergency incident as it is to preparedness and response, despite this being the lead role of local authorities. The long-term impact this will have on people and businesses in the local community, and the potential risks to the credibility and reputation of a local authority. Again, this is 3 years ago in 2018 and not 4 years ago. Do you agree with the description here that recovery is the Cinderella of emergency planning?
recovery is fundamental to local authorities restoring, recovering, allowing the community, the area to recover following a large-scale emergency, and it is a local authority lead responsibility.
Yep, I think we understand what recovery is, but do you agree with the description which is set out in this report, that it's down as this Cinderella, that it's not given the attention, the same level of attention as paid to the other phases?
I would suggest yes, then.
And as we've touched upon already, from the consideration of these two reports and your previous reports, EP20, you considered and consolidated these into your EP 2020 refresh. Is that correct?
Correct.
So with all this work that you were undertaking in your report, what did you consider the most important area, perhaps, that needed to be changed or attention needed to be put on?
I think the most important area was linked to the comment about it being everybody's business. It was about moving away from this reliance of the selected few to organisation ownership and the role and elements of resilience, emergency planning being overseen and driven by the relevant departments, the experts within those departments, rather than it all resting with emergency planners.
And that's one of the phrases you use in your third statement, which is embedding the philosophy of resilience is everybody's business. You consider that to be a key feature moving forward, is that correct?
I do, and a lot of work has been done to engage with various professional networks, directors of comms, directors of housing, to really embed that philosophy that they should be taking far more ownership of areas which best sit with them.
I'm going to move on to a number of areas, 5 areas in fact, which are recommendations and matters of discussion in EP 2020. Deal with standards. We have MSLs, Minimum Standards of London. We'll move on to resilience standards for London in a moment. The review of the Gold Resolution, community resilience, learnings from previous humanitarian responses and training. So we're going to touch upon those and draw a few threads together. But before I do so, the first one is resilience standards for London. And perhaps, Mr. Chairman, that may be a moment for a natural break, but I can...
Well, I assume that's going to take you a little while to deal
Yes.
with those, is that right?
Yes.
Then I think it'd be sensible to have a break now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Sawyer, I think it's time we had a short break. We'll stop now. We'll come back, please, at 3:30, and then we'll carry on there. And while you're out, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
No, of course, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
3:30, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Sawyer to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Sawyer, ready to carry on?
Very much so.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, welcome back, Mr. Sawyer. We're just going to deal with one of the first areas which flowed from your EP 2020 report, refresh report. And we have that right in front of us now. And if we can see recommendation 2, which is this: all London local authorities adopt the assurance framework recommended in the Sean Ruth Review 2018 and commit to credible self-assessment locally led by chief executives and overseen by members, which focuses on capacity and capability and organisational commitment to the resilience agenda. This local assurance is supported by sub-regional peer challenge and external independent peer review. So that was one of your core recommendations, isn't that correct?
Correct.
And that to be overseen by the local authority panel. We see it, we don't need to turn to it at recommendation 23. So in relation to that core recommendation, is it right that the resilience standards for London were launched in July 2019 and they replaced the minimum standards for London?
Correct.
And again, perhaps you could assist us, perhaps briefly. It may not be maybe a bit difficult to do so, but how do the resilience standards for London differ or are an improvement from the minimum standards for London?
Both in content and approach. In terms of content, it took 11 key thematic areas and focused on core areas of resilience which local authorities as organisationally wide should apply. So it wasn't solely focused on potentially the role of emergency planners. Resilience standards for London now focus on the responsibilities of organisations as a whole. In terms of approach, we've talked about minimum standards for London having an element of sub-regional peer challenge. That was very light touch, and it was emergency planners peer reviewing emergency planners. It didn't quite work from my perspective. So this now applies a 3-layered approach with the LGA currently providing that external peer, independent, impartial, independent peer challenge, which adds a more robust layer of sort of the process.
So 3 layers. Let's remind everyone what's layer 1 and layer 2.
Layer 1 is the local self-assessment.
Yes.
Layer 2 is sub-regional good practice workshops. So that's not necessarily a review of every standard in detail, but what it is an opportunity for boroughs to learn from other boroughs. Again, linking to some of the emphasis behind the original minimum standards for London, which was around identifying common trends, issues that need to be addressed. And as I say, the third component is that LGA peer challenge part of the process.
And the LGA being Local Government Association.
Yes, my apologies, yes.
I'd like us just to explore that theme of peer challenge and that as a theme. Perhaps we could look at your third statement, GOL 401847, please. And we could turn to page 2, thank you. Paragraph 9. So this is what you've written down in terms of areas. If you just scroll up just for a moment, please, so we see paragraph 6. We touched upon that already, embedding the philosophy of resilience as everyone's business. That was one of the key factors you mentioned, and let's move to another one of the key factors, which is in bold, at paragraph 9. Establishing an assurance process that is mandatory and enforceable. Let's read paragraph 10, please. I believe the resilience standards for London provide the means by which all London local authorities can effectively assess preparedness across the organisation. And we see there your views as to its being utilised. And if the approach is adopted by individual local authorities and applied, it will allow senior officers and local politicians to maintain effective oversight. and appropriate levels of transparency for communities to be cited on preparedness. I'm summarising because we have it in front of us, and perhaps more selective reading rather than summarising. But this is the part I'd like your assistance upon. To date, I believe there are varying levels of senior level commitment to RSLs, Resilience Standards for London, and the local authority panel, which oversaw the development of them, does not have the authority to insist that boroughs adopt the full approach. Currently signing up to the Local Government Association facilitated peer challenge is optional. Thank you for turning over. And the local authorities panel does not have the means of establishing a robust rolling programme to ensure all 32 local authorities and the City of London undergo external challenge. A solution is required to ensure individual and collective strengths and weaknesses in local authority resilience arrangements are generally understood, shared and addressed. Big paragraph, a lot of information in there. How many local authorities to date have not signed up to the Local Government Association facilitated peer challenge?
I believe currently 3 have undergone the process as part of the pilot review and as part of the pilot process. But to date, I'm not aware of any other local authority asking to be peer reviewed, peer challenged, let's say.
So 3 out of 33 have asked and participated in the peer challenge.
Yeah, it's worth contextually appreciating that the process was paused during COVID.
Yes.
And so it is expected that reinstating the process will start this year. My point is that whilst it remains optional, there is a risk that some local authorities won't necessarily buy into the full process and apply it as intended.
And the first paragraph, the first line of this paragraph is your belief, as you set out in your statement, something which you volunteered to the inquiry late last week. You believe that there are varying levels of senior level commitment to RSLs and the local authority panel. Is that the position?
Some of that view is based on some anecdotal evidence.
Yes.
Some evidence to suggest that the standards, the self-assessments are being completed by emergency planning teams as compared to being overseen and worked on by senior officers. So it's flagging a risk in the process and system that through more effective and enforceable management of the process would address.
And how could that be achieved? You talk about a solution is required, and you mention something which is more effective and enforceable management of the process. If you had a magic wand, how would you achieve that?
If I knew how to achieve that, I'd probably have included in the statement. Apologies to be flippant, but it would require some either government-led policy included in some level of legislation perhaps. What I've done by recording this is just highlighting to me the risk that remains whilst this is an optional process.
So optional process, and the local authority panel don't have the power to enforce this.
Exactly.
So it's dependent, as we heard already, as was in relation to MSLs, dependent on the individual local authority adherence and commitment to resilience. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and yeah, at the right level.
Let's move on to central government, which is sort of, you've talked about government involvement. Is it correct that central governments do not have a formal role in the assessment or inspection of emergency planning and resilience at a local level?
That is not of local authorities, no.
No. So they don't participate in any local assurance framework?
No.
I wondered if we could go back to the assurance framework review by Sean Ruth, please. GOL *01596 at page 16, please. This is something you considered when doing your EP 2020 refresh. Paragraph 4.9. It is clear that central government do not have plans at this time to put in place any process that imposes mandates or regulates local authorities, in addition to legislation that currently exists. However, given its role in national resilience arrangements and its relationship with local resilience forums, there could be an enhanced role in supporting local authorities where it's appropriate to do so on a voluntary basis at the request of the local organisation. It talks about peer review and training and development. You see peer review at the bottom of that page, and we don't need to turn over training and development. You were asked your views regarding this in your second statement, and perhaps we could turn to your second statement, please. GOL *0001839, about the options in relation to central government involvement. And paragraph 59, thank you. Thank you so much. And this is what the question was asked over Leaf, really, in relation to this aspect of the Assurance Framework Review. And your answer is this: a number of options were explored during the Assurance Review to determine the most appropriate method of external and independent challenge. Options included a government inspectorate, ruled out early during discussions with CCS, Civil Contingency Secretariat. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Do you know why it was ruled out in those early discussions with the Civil Contingency Secretariat?
No, those would have been conversations between Sean Ruth and the CCS.
Yes. Not something you've got knowledge of
No.
in your dealings?
No.
I'm going to continue from paragraph 59. A national public sector body such as the Local Government Association, which you touched upon moments ago, a private sector organisation such as one of the big four accounting firms, and subject matter expert, SME, commissioned specifically for the work. And then we've paragraph 60, one of the options discussed was the CCS matching peers from across the LRF system to London Borough for peer review purposes. This option was not explored further due to other priorities within the CCS. Do you know why that was, what the other priorities were, as alluded to here?
No, again, I wasn't party to those conversations.
Although I'm reading from your statement.
Yes.
You're summarising what the position is, but you're not able to assist with what underpins that information.
No, and provided in the spirit of sharing as much as I
Yes.
could.
And it's also understood that consideration has been given to adopting this process or national standards too. So against that background, you then say this: there is, bottom of paragraph 62, there's however merit in the government further considering its role and the value of assembling an independent peer review team, as this would connect to emergency planning and resilience work being undertaken at national, regional and local level. So this is your second statement. We perhaps may have fast forwarded to your third statement already, and it's a similar topic, but in relation to that last matter, what's your view about what could be done to connect emergency planning at national, regional and local level?
I would suggest that further conversations on the proposal as detailed there in terms of the viability of that, etc., I think would be an effective way of linking national through to local. I think aligning the approach that we apply in London via the LGA, which is a national organisation, to approaches across the rest of the country, because you know it's fair to say that London has its unique ways of working, but actually there's lots of learning and lots of sharing to be done across the country as well. So that's another way of addressing that. But I think what I was keen to do was get the current approach re-established, get full buy-in from all 33 to that approach, assess the value that approach applies, the success, for want of a better word, and then determine as to whether there's any further work to be done on aligning it nationally. So work in progress.
And currently, do you think that there is this connection between local, regional and national resilience?
In terms of assurance,
Yes.
yeah, I think there's the two layers of assurance currently applied, or several layers. One is the layer in which LRFs and the multi-agency aspect is assessed via the national approach, and we obviously have our sector-specific local authority approach.
Yes.
It's something that don't have sufficient detail to be able to provide any further sort of comment on that at this point.
Well, I'm going to move on to a second area, which is a review of the gold resolution and addendum. That's something which is identified in your EP 2020 refresh report under the heading Governance Recommendation 8. And it was recommended that there should be a review and to consider options to make triggers and the escalation process clear. Is that right?
Yes.
If we could turn to GOL 50146, please. This is something in the Independent Peer Challenge. And turn to page 14, please, paragraph 20H. Four lines down, it says this: there's also a need for greater clarity about the different roles of the Borough Gold, LLAG, and the chair of the local authority panel in the context of the gold resolution, including extending this clarity to handling the communications and the media and to the handover from response to recovery. The peer challenge identified an appetite to quickly strengthen the current gold resolution to increase the leverage of LLAG through the LAP chair and to provide a more proactive and speedy response in exceptional circumstances. For example, when a borough needs help but does not request it. Is that right? That was the sort of context which was highlighted in the Independent Peer Challenge report.
Correct.
Which flowed into the recommendation you made in your report.
Yes.
A latter progress report, which again I don't think we need to look at. What happened was, in relation to your EP 2020, there was an implementation report which was completed, and a progress report which was provided to London councils, and one of those was provided in July 2019. And in that, there's reference that after legal advice, that it was not possible, in simple terms, to activate the gold resolution without the consent of the local authority in question. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
So in very simple terms, John Bardell couldn't stepped in of his own volition and took control.
Going back to my comment this morning, no legal basis upon which to intervene.
That all concerned the interpretation of the statutory powers under Section 138 of the Local Government Act, 1972.
Yes.
So in light of that advice received, is it the position the local authority panel developed guidance in August 2018 for chief executives?
Correct.
In relation to the gold resolution and its activation?
Yes.
And it may be obvious, what was the purpose of this guidance?
It was to clarify how the gold arrangements are activated and applied, and the breadth of the responsibility.
And in your view, do you consider that that guidance addresses the concerns raised in the peer challenge review?
I think it strengthens understanding, and if we have stronger understanding, it's more likely that the misunderstandings that potentially occurred in the early stages of the Grenfell response won't occur again.
Let's have a look at your second statement in relation to this. GOL 401839, paragraph 10, please, on page 2. This really just fleshes out your view that the guidance assists greater understanding. You mentioned in paragraph 10, instruction on how the guidance should be applied is delivered in 3 ways. Shared with chief executives as part of their induction into local authority regional resilience arrangements, correct?
Correct.
referenced in the more detailed London Local Authority Gold LAG briefing session provided by London Resilience Group, the chief executives.
Correct.
And finally incorporated into pre-on-call briefings. So something which is mentioned a lot by chief executives in their role as London Local Authority Gold.
Correct.
It's also incorporated into London Local Authority Gold operating procedure, which is shared role with chief executives.
Correct.
Has that been improved in terms of the process as to activation, in your view?
The major shift is an increased emphasis on proactivity. And I think we've seen in incidents recently over the last couple of years where that proactivity has led to earlier conversations between Local Authority Gold and the affected boroughs Gold to assess whether additional support is required or not.
And you touch upon that in relation to more recent exercises and how it provides an opportunity to secure understanding about how the affected borough was addressing demands and proactively ensured availability of wider support was understood by all and coordinated required.
Correct, and by including it in the exercises, we're not only making sure the Local Authority Gold performing that role in the exercise fully understands it, but that knowledge is shared across other Golds from other boroughs.
So more guidance, better understanding, more proactivity.
Yes.
Turn on to the Mayor of London, if I may, please. In relation to the role of the Mayor of London in London Resilience, we've heard that his role is not operational, but is to act as the voice of London. Is that correct?
Correct.
What is your view as to the suggestion which is made by the Mayor of London in their opening submissions to this module, that there may be a need for the formal role of the Mayor of London in a civil emergency to be expanded in carefully defined circumstances to require the invocation of mutual aid and appropriate leadership arrangements? In other words, it seems to have some role in the activation of the Gold Resolution.
I would suggest that may well be legally challenging to find a solution to that. But that said, I believe that by better defining the role of Local Authority Gold, by establishing that proactive approach to ensuring that we don't wait to be asked, we actually ask, the Local Authority Gold asks, do you need help, support? By applying that more proactive approach, we will hopefully have addressed the concerns that arose during Grenfell.
Let's look at your statement, please. Second statement. Thank you. JGOL 401839. Page 6, please. You were asked this question at question 48. And the question was, as part of your work undertaken in your EP 2020 refresh report, what consideration has been given to the role of the Mayor of London? And you say at paragraph 49, I'm not aware of any consideration being given to the role of the Mayor of London within the work undertaken to deliver the original EP 2020 prospectus. That's the 2016. And the EP 20 refresh report, beyond that of delivering the voice of London. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And if we could turn over leaf, please, to paragraph 50. During the simplification process associated to the LLG operation procedure, it was determined not to include reference to the role of the Mayor. The Mayor's role is, however, included in the London Strategic Coordination Framework and incorporated into the LAG arrangements, briefings, to chief executives and relevant exercises. And lastly, to question 8 in this supplementary statement, you were asked, has there been any requests or any identified needs to expand the Mayor's role from beyond being the voice of London to an operational role? Requests in part of your work in the EP 2020 refresh, considerations of the 2 other reports. And your answer is at paragraph 52, I'm not aware of any requests and or identified need to expand the Mayor's role. Is that the position?
Correct.
In relation to an expanded role for the Mayor, is there anything else you consider is necessary to add to that?
Not at this time.
Training. It was recommended in the EP 2020 refresh report that all chief executives and their deputies attend periodical training events and participate in a structured exercise programme to prepare them to undertake LLAG duties. And that's something which is, I believe, recommendation 20. Was that recommendation made because there was an identified gap in training provided hitherto?
In relation to performing the role of local authority gold, I think there was an identified need to ensure that training was delivered and that there was appropriate opportunities for exercising of that role, and on occasions exercising opportunities can be few and far between. So the question was, how can we improve that and ensure that all 33 local authorities undertook an appropriate level of training in that role?
In your view, was there a need to improve training for chief executives for the LLAJ role?
Yes, there was.
In his evidence and inquiry, Nicholas Holgate stated this, day 273, page 223, line 19. I think the ability to deal to the quality that we would all want, our ability to address the needs of the survivors, the bereaved and others after a tragedy of this scale would require an intensity and an extent of preparation which to me, in all probability, goes well beyond what was then expected, even of a compliant authority. Do you consider that the training which was available pre-June 2017 was sufficient to equip a chief executive or a council gold to respond to an instance such as Grenfell?
I think we need to delineate training in terms of the local authority gold role to training that should be delivered to anybody performing the role of council gold.
Yes.
And I think, if you don't mind me saying, on the day of the fire, Nicholas Holgate was performing the role of council gold, not local authority gold.
Correct.
So the local authority gold training builds on training that should be delivered locally.
So it's two levels. The local authority is responsible for training its own, effectively.
Yes, very much so. And then the local authority gold training places that knowledge, experience into a regional context. And that regional context is a coordination role, not a command and control role.
So in your wider work, were you able to identify any deficits in terms of the training which was available at the local authority level, in relation to council goals?
No. We never delved into that level of detail in terms of what was being delivered locally.
I'm going to move on to community resilience. Fourth of, coming to the end of questions now, Mr. Sawyer. So in relation to community resilience and community engagement, again, these were recommendations in your EP 2020 report, 6 and 24, that boroughs, local authorities recognise the importance of community resilience and have clear communication, engagement and liaison plans in place with strong relationships across each sector that are well connected to emergency plans and understands the impact of incidents on their communities. So I've combined probably two recommendations together, but in essence, in terms of community resilience, was it the case that there was an identified need for real improvements?
Yes.
And that was in part as a result of Grenfell Tower, isn't that correct? The need to improve community resilience.
Yes.
Is it the case that the London Resilience Partnership Community Steering Group was set up as a result of the work you recommended? And that's chaired by the Chief Executive of London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham.
That's correct. It was chaired by that Chief Executive.
And this London Resilience Partnership Community Steering Group was established in 2018 to provide advice, guidance and support to other local authorities in relation to this area. Is that correct?
Correct.
And developing community resilience, a review, was a document prepared by that steering group in July 2019, and that identified a number of principles, including, quote, the need to maintain deep respect and value the role of communities and community organisations. Is that correct?
Correct.
And something which you touch upon in your second statement, that the London Resilience Forum funded a community resilience coordinator. And you state at paragraph 28 that work is also likely to begin soon to build on community resilience activities and support local authorities and other stakeholders at local level. So drawing it all together, in relation to that coordinator role, is that something which is still pending at this stage?
I'm not cited on the status of that role. That is an LRF-funded role that's being hosted by the GLA, Greater London Authority.
Okay. The time of your second statement, which was April 2022, it's classified as ongoing rather than completed.
I haven't had an update on that role.
So in relation to the matters as to you recommended in relation to community resilience and community engagement, do you consider those two features are sufficient to bring about the recommendations you identified in EP 2020 Refresh?
I think that to genuinely support the community to be more resilient takes lots of activity at a very local level to make a difference. So the work of the steering group produced guidance. It's a bit like we talked about previously, the role of LAP in terms of producing guidance and helping to provide tools for local authorities to implement locally. That was a similar motivation behind that guidance document to then allow the various agencies and allow local authorities to consider that guidance and look at what it meant in terms of applying it locally. I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that there was the fantastic community effort, both in Grenfell but also during COVID, the COVID response, and relationships between community, faith, voluntary sector and the funders sector was really reinforced during that period. And we're currently in a position whereby I believe London Funders, which is an umbrella organisation representing a significant number of community groups, etc., are leading on work to further strengthen those relationships, strengthen those networks, and again provide another conduit for supporting the conversation on community resilience via the GLA coordinator all the way through to the local ward level activity within local authorities. So as to whether those recommendations have been actually delivered, it has to continue to be work in progress, but it's just being discharged through a different route.
In some respects, it's an unfair question, but it's just a start, isn't it,
yes,
in relation to what you've done?
You'll never complete community resilience in its entirety. Will always be a work in progress. It's just making sure that the right level of support is available to deliver it.
And is it right that there is an interplay between community resilience and the resilience standards of London? That's something which there is a specific standard in relation to community engagement.
Yeah, and that documents quite clearly what good looks like.
Finally, in relation to this topic, is whether you can have any views as to the requirements under the CCA Civil Contingency Act regulations, Regulation 23, whether a Category 1 responder, where it says must have regard to the activities of the voluntary organisations when carrying on their activities, whether you consider that regulation framework is sufficient or whether there needs to be more in relation to that.
I think you can never downplay the important role of voluntary sector, faith sector, the community as a whole, and I think there is anything that can be done to further reinforce the importance of that has to be considered. I don't have the answer, but I think it has to be reinforced. Yes.
I'm going to move on to the fifth area, which is learning from previous humanitarian responses. So one of the recommendations recommended that the local authorities panel commission a review of current plans and exercising so as to build on learnings from the experience of humanitarian welfare response provided to victims and survivors in 2017. Can you assist in relation to progress of that? What was the scope of this review of current plans and exercising as part of that recommendation?
Is there a way you can put that up on screen? Because
Yes, of course I can.
if you don't mind.
If we could bring up, please, GOL 00401346. And just like magic, there it is. Thank you so much. So it's recommendation 18.
Yeah, okay.
Just to give you a moment, it's quite a dense paragraph, building on learning from the experience of humanitarian welfare response in 2017.
Okay, fine. I can update you on that. As a result of this, the local authorities panel established a humanitarian assistance program, which had input at a strategic level from the directors of adult social services within London, led by an emergency planning manager with experience of recent incidents affecting communities. And that programme contained a number of work streams, of which over the last 2 or 3 years work has been progressed. And I believe I provided an update to the inquiry of the status of that programme.
I can assist you in relation to that, and we can perhaps summarise it. So in relation to that humanitarian assistance programme you identified, that was to also develop policies and procedures for local authorities in providing wraparound support to survivors. And in relation to that wraparound support, you mentioned that a draft version of guidance for key worker support to people critically affected by emergency guidance has been approved by the local authority panel this February. Is that correct?
Correct.
And it states, you state in your statements, paragraph 5 of your second statement, that it will be further developed through a robust pilot programme.
Correct.
And that it stems from lessons learned from the Grenfell Tower.
Correct.
So that those lessons learned from the Grenfell Tower have been reflected in this draft guidance for wraparound support for key workers.
And other pieces of work within that programme.
It's nearly 5 years since events, and we talked about reviews in 2017, 2018, and it's draft guidance in February 2022. Pausing there, we also had COVID intervening in that period of time. But are you satisfied with the pace of delivery in relation to this guidance and these improvements?
No.
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 Why not satisfied with the pace of delivery?
I would have preferred them to be delivered much quicker.
And what's the barrier to bringing in improvements which are identified as part of your work earlier?
I believe local government doesn't often do things quickly, but that's not an excuse. I believe that it's an indication that a lot of these pieces of work are being progressed not by people with dedicated responsibility to that piece of work. So they have their day job to deliver as well. So the prioritisation of work or establishing sufficient capacity in the system to enable these pieces of work to be delivered more quickly currently doesn't exist.
And the solution is greater capacity and greater prioritisation.
Investment.
In terms of, finally, wider observations, drawing together your work for the EP 2020 refresh has resulted, as you've set upon in your statements, and we haven't gone through a lot of it, is various additional guidance documents have been produced to add to the London Resilience suite of documents. There's been a concept of operations. We've had the resilience standards for London. There's a civil resilience handbook. There's a humanitarian assistance framework has been updated. The guidance we touched upon in relation to wraparound support. Guidance we touched upon in relation to chief executive and the activation of LLAG. And there's more guidance in relation to mutual aid and emergency planning teams, which is being referred to in your statement. Is there a danger that the field of resilience is becoming saturated with too many plans and guidance documents?
Not necessarily saturated, because I can see a purpose for each of those documents. The challenge we have is that those documents are well known probably by, again, my favourite term today, those selected few. And we need to find a way whereby that level of knowledge of those relevant plans, frameworks, is not just shared, but actually maintained. So I think in my third statement, I reference the challenge of conflicting priorities and officers dipping in and out of resilience.
Yes.
So we need to find a way whereby that level of knowledge isn't continually, it's not even refreshed. They're told multiple times because they hear, forget, come back, hear, forget, come back. So it's a cycle of continually repetition, as compared to we need to find a way whereby that is maintained.
So for an individual who is not one of the select few, but has some involvement or responsibility, they will be greeted, will they not be, with national guidance. In London, there will be the regional guidance, and then at their local authority, you're going to have the local guidance and plans. Is there a danger that quite important messages may actually be lost due to the volume and density of the material?
Potentially, if you're expecting somebody to know it all, but I think what we need to be is much more precise in terms of what someone needs to know to enable them to perform effectively. And then maintain that level of knowledge.
And in terms of that maintaining the knowledge, you'd also accept that there also needs to be a sufficient number of trained staff in place to ensure that the knowledge and plans which flow from them are acted upon when the time arises. Isn't that correct?
Very much right people in the right roles with the right knowledge and in the right numbers.
Perhaps you could bring up what you alluded to a moment ago in your last statement, please. Paragraph 3, GOL 401847. Am I right? And that's what you were alluding to, professionalising the local authority approach to incident response. You say this: local authorities need to take their responsibility at being Category 1 responders more seriously and accept that the right people with their appropriate skills need to be identified and installed in the right numbers into response roles at every level. To support these officers, the problem of dipping in and out of interest in resilience-related matters and finding other priorities which prevent full engagement has to be formally addressed. Is that the position?
I believe it is. I may have used slightly different terms in reference to finding other priorities. I think other priorities find them.
Okay. And when you say it has to be formally addressed, what do you mean by formally addressed?
We need to, if a solution can be found, then it should be found. And not just continue accepting this is the way it works.
Is mindset a fact here? Do you think organisationally the mindset has to change towards the importance of civil resilience?
Corporate ownership.
And is it your view that local authorities currently still need to take responsibility in relation to being Category 1 responders more seriously?
There are some local authorities who are better prepared than others.
And can you say why they're better prepared than others?
Probably greater corporate ownership.
Okay. Mr. Sawyer, I'm grateful for your patience and the patience of the panel. They're all the questions I have for you this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, with your leave, if we perhaps have a short pause to see if there's any questions.
Yes. Well, Mr. Sawyer, when council gets to the end of his questions, we have a short break just to let him take stock, but also to allow an opportunity for other people who are following the proceedings from elsewhere to suggest questions. So we'll break now. We'll come back at 4:25. And at that point, we'll see if there are any more questions we ought to ask you.
Thank you.
All right. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you. We say 4:25. If you need more time, perhaps you could just let the usher tell us. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. would you ask Mr. Sawyer to come back in, please? Okay. Right, Mr. Sawyer, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One question which has arisen, which perhaps you could assist us with, Mr. Sawyer, is this. We were talking about resilience standards for London, and we're talking about the pilot scheme, the voluntary pilot scheme, which is operated by the LGA, those independent peer challenges. In relation to that, you mentioned that 3 local authorities so far have participated or asked to participate in that. Can you assist whether ORBKC was one of those 3 local authorities?
No, they weren't one of those authorities.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mr. Sawyer, is this, in relation to your evidence, is there anything else that you wanted to add which may assist the inquiry with its investigations?
Nothing extra to what I included in my third statement, and other than that to say that given this time again, which I know we can't get back, I would have made less of an assumption that Nicholas Holgate genuinely understood what invoking the gold arrangement meant, and that wouldn't have meant that he would have stepped aside to allow another chief executive to take over. And I think had I known that even on the 14th, that may have been able to be addressed. Okay, so that's really in terms of what I would do differently and what I think should happen. I do have a personal statement, if I would be allowed to make that personal statement.
Is this the statement that I read on your third statement?
It is, and if I would be allowed to speak publicly to that and refer to my statement, I'd be really grateful.
Yes, all right.
Thank you. Just a little bit of context to why I wrote this statement, and I thought very hard about it, which is why I want to refer to it, because I want to get this right. In the evening, a warm evening in late July, early August 2017, I attended a meeting with the community in the law centre underneath the finger blocks. And quite innocently, at the end of a long meeting, quite late in the evening, innocently said to the then chair of Grenfell United, I hope my wife's going to be okay, because I'm going to need her to pick me up from the station because I'm going to get home really late. Without an ounce of malice, he said to me, well, at least you have a home to go to. So that places into context, for me, what Grenfell means. Now, what I have written here is that in July 2017, I was asked by John Barradell to contact members of Grenfell United and see if I could help them with direct discussions with RBKC and in any way possible. I obviously agreed to this, determined to provide support in any way possible. Through this process, I met the most amazing people who conducted themselves during a period of trauma, pain, anguish, sadness, and frustration in the most dignified, compassionate, and proud way possible. I was humbled by the experience and remain humbled by the experience. One of the main things from this experience I will carry with me for the rest of my life is the hope that people never again have to endure the pain that these good people had to suffer. In any situation, whether it be day-to-day life or whether it be an emergency, people always must come first. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Sawyer, it just remains for me to say on behalf of the council team, thank you so much for attending today and assisting the inquiry in its investigations and providing your evidence. Thank you.
And it's right that I should thank you as well, Mr. Sawyer, on behalf of the panel. It's been very helpful for us to get your assistance in relation to the workings of London Resilience. We've learned a lot and we're very grateful to you. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And you're free to go.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Keating. That's it for the day,
Yes, it is,
and
thank you.
we shall have another witness tomorrow.
Yes, Mr. Millett's back tomorrow with Mr. Barradell.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We break there then, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.